Well, thank you very much. First of all, thanks everyone for coming. I'm quite excited to give an in-person talk again. Does everybody have jelly beans? Yes, this is going to be this is the part you will remember of this talk. I hope at least. So I got over a decade ago quite obsessed with the sense of smell. And of course, not knowing that this would become a thing, when I started, many people wondering why smell, etc. And I want to just highlight actually this picture, which was from an Italian restaurant in New York. Oh, good point. Thank you. Oh, yeah. This is from an Italian restaurant in New York, where outside you've got this massive nose, and I just love the picture of all the kind of famous noses, because usually this is not how you remember or recognize faces. That being said, when I started out working on smell, and I thought like this is an ideal model system to really think about how our mind works, how our brain works. People thought I was a bit mad because if you look at the history of science, if you look at the history of the philosophy, what you see is a lot of bad opinions about the sense of smell. And you could kind of compare it to an Amazon review, where it gets a lot of one-star reviews. So the French philosopher Etienne Bonneau de Condillac, for instance, said, well, of all the senses, it is the one which appears to contribute least to the cognitions of the human mind. Not very friendly, but I gotta say, unfortunately, the Germans went much better. None other than the great pillar of Prussian precision, Immanuel Kant, said, which sense is the most ungrateful and the most dispensable? The sense of smell. It does not pay to cultivate it, for there are more disgusting things than pleasant ones, especially in crowded places. Now, he had a point there, but it was not just simply the philosophers. Unfortunately, it was also the fellow scientists who said, well, actually, for instance, Charles Darwin, that the sense of smell is of extremely slight service to mankind, or now we would say humankind. And you might wonder, well, okay, that was just history. Unfortunately, we find the same opinions also today. So Steven Pinker, for instance, in How the Mind Works, described the olfactory system as shriveled up and vestigial. So many people, when I started out with smell, were like, well, why do you work on that? It doesn't seem to actually tell us much about how the mind works. It seems to be an evolutionary decline. We can't seem to describe smells very well. We don't know what they are. And then I cannot tell you how much the smell community was kind of excited about COVID, because it turns out that this revealed how much of our life quality and our sensory perception is basically based on smell. So suddenly people were losing their sense of smell, realizing all the food smells, all the environments, the people are basically connected to our nose. And I remember actually I got a call from a friend of mine in the middle of nowhere. I was just working lunchtime. She's like, well, I just came out of the shower and I thought of you. This is not our usual relationship. But it turned out she suddenly was under the shower. She lost her sense of smell. She ran into the kitchen. She couldn't smell her like shampoo and everything. It was gone. It was from as if suddenly her nose was mute. She ran into the kitchen. She opened all the jars, nothing. So she asked me like, what could that mean? I was like, well, you might want to do a COVID test. And of course, the question is, because she's like, well, okay, fair enough. And turned out she had COVID. But many people described it actually as losing their sense of taste. Suddenly food was bland and you couldn't taste anything. And we often hear this, yeah, well, smell and taste are connected. But more and more people were interested, well, how was it connected? Like, why do I actually lose everything in terms of taste when my nose is affected? And this is one of the most awesome discoveries about the sense of smell that first was described retronasal flavor at the end of the 19th century, fairly late. Even somebody like Immanuel Kant must have had at some point a cold. Even Darwin must have had the common cold, where you also have a reduced sense of smell. And you actually have not one, but two senses of smell. So the first one is the one you, of course, know about, which is orthonasal olfaction, like the sniffing in. And how that works is you've got these volatile airborne molecules that basically travel up the nasal cavity. Oh, wait, I've got actually a pointer. That travel up the nasal cavity to the olfactory epithelium, which has the sensory neurons expressing the olfactory receptors, which is where the molecules kind of touch and tangle with the receptors. And the signal is then projected to the olfactory bulb at the inferior frontal lobe of the brain. From there, further projected to the olfactory cortex, projects to the amygdala, the orbitofrontal cortex, a lot involved with decision making. Seems like a fairly simple system. we also have a second sense of smell. And I say second sense of smell, why I actually say it's kind of different in a moment, which is retronasal olfaction. And this is when you chew your food, what happens is that the aroma molecules travel through the back of your throat up to your nose and interact with the olfactory receptors again in the nose. So you really have kind of the retronasal mouth breathing smell. And then there's kind of a cross sensory firework. You've got interaction with, of course, sound, with texture, temperature, vision, all kinds of things. Why did I say this is a second sense of smell? Well, first of all, it doesn't have the same qualitative properties. For instance, if you have coffee, awesome orthonasal like aroma, the taste is kind of disappointing. Nobody says, hey, wake up to the taste. What? Okay. I thought like, okay, somebody's like, no, the taste of coffee is better than the smell. So nobody says wake up to the taste of coffee. It's always the smell. You also have the opposite. You know, I'm a huge fan of stinky French cheese, but when I was a kid, I hated the smell. I opened the fridge of my mother. It's like, oh my goodness. Now I love it because the flavor, the aroma, the flavor is much different than just smelling it. It smells like stinky cheese. It smells like feet of a teenager who hasn't showered for a while. But the flavor is different. And you might wonder, how can it be so different phenomenologically that what you inhale is not the same as what you retronasally smell, basically? Well, it turns out one of the reasons is when you have basically a difference in airflow. So you've got air coming from your lungs, pushing the molecules from your throat to your nose. So you have a different temperature and you have a different airflow, leading to a difference in which molecules hit your nasal epithelium first, leading actually to a difference in terms of how the receptor patterns, what are the first molecules, etc. So it's both physiologically as well as qualitatively a different sense. And I do believe in actually showing to what extent your whole sensory system really is like taste is really actually smell. So this is where the jelly beans come in. You gotta entertain me for a while. So this looks a bit stupid, but bear with me. What I want you to do is pinch your nose so that you can't smell a thing. Like really, really badly pinch it. It looks stupid. And then put the jelly bean in your mouth while you have the nose pinched and taste it. Focus on what you actually taste. And now release your nose and breathe out. Suddenly, like the fruity note, whatever it was, like it might be berry, it might be like it might be a cherry, it might be a strawberry, it might be lemon, whatever it is, hits your nose. You can do the same with wine. You can do the same with beer, with whiskey, whatever. Everything smells actually retronasally. And you know it, but then you experience it. So I do believe in the kind of aspect of experience. This is what people lost during COVID. The question is, of course, why didn't people take it seriously? Because one of the key things I was surprised by is really, well, a lot of people actually were first saying, well, this seems to be some kind of subjective thing. So lots of clinicians weren't taking smell loss as one of the key criteria for COVID, even though it would have been one of the first things that people lose, so that even people who are otherwise asymptomatic could be known like, okay, they have COVID and I might want to take a test, etc. But a lot of doctors in the beginning of the pandemic, it took a while to integrate smell loss as a key criterion. People say, yeah, but it's subjective, it's anecdotal. So by the way, respiratory problems. Like there was no peer-reviewed study going like, oh yeah, respiratory problems are apparently a thing. But for smell, yeah, there are not enough studies. So a lot of clinicians became at some point quite interested in smell loss because they realized, okay, a lot of patients seem to experience that. But it took a while to get it officially accepted. And the reason for that is that smell still suffers from the kind of verdict of, yeah, but it's subjective. It's anecdotal, we can't take it seriously. You often have, when you have smell loss, the clinician saying, it's just a loss of quality of life. It's not so bad compared to other diseases. What do you mean by just? I mean, life is about a certain form of quality. So this is what drove me mad, because it seems to be, it's just this kind of neglectable sense. It's subjective. It doesn't give us a deeper insight into both physiology as well as the mind. And I remember there was a talk at the Association for Chemoreception Sciences, the 40th anniversary in 2018, where one of my favorite researchers, Leslie Kay at Chicago, gave a talk there. And at some point, she was bombarded with questions in the Q&A. And people was like, yeah, what about this? And this is a confounding factor. And here behavior might be influenced. She works on rats, smell in rats. And she was at some point like, I get it. Like, smell is contextual. This influences it, that, and that could confound it. I get it. But if everything is contextual, what remains constant? What remains the same? And that burned itself into my mind and led me down this rabbit hole to think about what is actually the constancy that defines olfaction. Because it's flexible, it's variable, but that doesn't make it necessarily subjective. And this is what I want to basically do today in the rest of the talk. First of all, well, why is smell actually really interesting to think about, both for scientists as well as philosophers? Then I want to look at, okay, as a philosopher, how should we study smell and why it really, really needs science? So this needs to be an integrated study. And then the main point for today is to get rid of the stain of subjectivity. So the main point is really variability. Variation is not the same as subjectivity, and why that is matters. And then I give you a twist. I'm going to convince you, hopefully, that actually it's easier to trick your eyes than your nose. And then I want to end with, okay, what's the way forward? What's the lesson for philosophers going forward to do with sensory systems such as smell, but many others actually, such as interoception, how our body perceives itself, etc. So what makes smell or thinking about smell so interesting for philosophy of science is that it defeats all our presupposed intuitions about what perception is about. When we talk about vision, we talk about perceptual objects or the objects of perception. What would that be in smell? We don't have the neat boundaries. We do perceive smells as a distance, but it's not so clear, and it seems to be sometimes, well, not so clear cut. Also, we wouldn't talk about the directionality of a smell as we would talk about a visual object. So clearly, we lack a certain form of conceptual framework. The second reason is it's also interesting from the sciences. Because how do you turn smell, what seems to be so subjective, into a measurable thing in the lab? How do you standardize it? How do you compare it? That's not a new challenge. It was actually in 1914 that Alexander Graham Bell wonderfully summarized this challenge in a small pamphlet called Discovery and Invention. It's online, read it, it's so much fun. Where he said, did you ever try to measure a smell? Can you tell whether one smell is just twice as strong as another? Can you measure the difference between one kind of smell and another? It is very obvious that we have very many different kinds of smell, all the way from the odor of violets, roses, up to asafoetida, word. But until you can measure their likeness and differences, you can have no science of odor. If you are ambitious to found a new science, measure a smell. I'll be honest, that sentence kind of got me. And the nice thing is that this is what has been a challenge addressed by recent science. This is a very young and new model system because the olfactory receptors in your nose were discovered only in 1991 by Linda Buck and Richard Axel at Columbia University. That was just a bit more than 30 years ago that you had this anniversary. And that discovery catapulted olfaction from being this eccentric little footnote in the history of science into mainstream hardcore neuroscience. Because it turns out that the receptors are part of the largest multi-gene family in most mammalian genomes, except for dolphins. And it turns out that a lot of, so these are GPCRs, G protein coupled receptors, they're involved in a lot of fundamental processes, from the regulation of immune responses to vision to many other processes. And it's the largest family within that superfamily. In fact, up to 4% of the mammalian genome is dedicated to olfactory GPCRs. That's more than the immune system. So people realized, hey, this is a genetic goldmine. Like we might be able to understand structure-function relations with this super diverse, large family. But the more money came in, the more questions came about. Namely, one thing is, for instance, well, how do we actually classify and categorize smells? We have the interface now, we've got the chemicals, we've got the brain, but we actually don't have a good model of olfaction. So one thing is really that we don't have a straightforward stimulus response model. And that's not because smell is subjective, but because it's chemically very complex. And I come to that in a moment. The other question that fascinates me more and more is, okay, in addition to what are smells, how does the brain actually represent smells? And this is a question that turned out to show that smell might be a wonderful way to rethink both the mind and the brain. Like with the other senses, we have a neat topographic organization. When we look at the brain, for instance, the huge difference between visual perception, between auditory perception, and the somatosensory system, in contrast with smell, is that smell doesn't have spatial representation in the same sense. So in vision, you have retinotopy, meaning I can tell, for instance, what part of the primary visual cortex, like how from the retina the signal is projected to the primary visual cortex. You can also have the same, you've got the bow plan, the body map of the motor system on the motor strip. By the way, this is the original Wilder-Penfield figure, like a fellow Canadian, which you can tell because the genitals are there. It was later censored, just historical fact, which I find funny. Then there's also the auditory system, where you have the basilar membrane. If you lay it out like a piano, you can really tell, for instance, where the kind of higher and the lower pitch notes are. And this is projected further to the auditory cortex. So you've got a neat map. How would you map odors in the brain? Do you put jasmine over here, mint over there? That's not how it works. Do you put, let's say, a certain range of carbon chain length atoms over there, or some kind of bicyclical compounds over there, like chemical features? Also not what happens. So how does the brain represent smells is connected to the question of what are smells? How do you classify them? What's the object we seem to be trying to categorize? And that's basically what got me so interested in smell, because it's clear that this is a very, very new model system. It's ongoing, and I mentioned already the receptors were discovered only in 1991. That means that the people who did all that kind of frontiers research are still alive. Not many historians of science can say, hey, I can talk to the people I actually work about. So I was always, when you read the history of science, you always wonder, how must it have been to be there at the frontiers of science, to talk to the people who do the crucial experiments? Well, I could talk to them, so I did. And what I realized more and more is that you talk to 3 scientists, you get 5 different answers to one problem if you're lucky. Because there's so many people, nobody starts out with smell going like, well, I always like a little child, I wanted to crack the code in the nose. Maybe solve Alzheimer, maybe kind of cure cancer, but smell, people come from all walks of life. So you find chemists there, you find psychologists there, you find neuroscientists there, then you've got computational neuroscience, behavioral neuroscience, physics, you've got 2. So people come from all walks of life and thereby define what smell is differently. And it's constantly changing what the key is. And that got me excited because, of course, this raises a methodological question for any philosopher interested in science. How do you study a model system that's constantly in flux in terms of studies, in terms of what's conceived of as the current best explanation, and with new studies changing that, having paradigm shifts in the Kuhnian sense, etc. And this is where I think it's a good system to also think about our role of as philosophers within the sciences, so to speak. And if we look at smell, there are actually 3 ways to study it. And the first one is, of course, well, we sit in our armchairs and we think about what our perception is about, what the content of perception is. And there we quickly see that if we compare philosophers, I mean, it's not necessarily news to you that you will find no agreement. Everybody has a different opinion. So some people like Thomas Reid, for instance, said, well, the experience of smell is about nothing but itself, meaning it's purely subjective. Like there's nothing accountable for the sensation you're having. Then you've got other people, more recently Claire Batty, who said, actually, no, smells are properties of objects. So they're about something in the world. There's an intentionality, we're directed towards something, but there's no clear-cut relation because we seem to have this oozy-woozy modification of consciousness, not necessarily clear-cut representation. So is smell about something or just about itself? Good question. Then you have differences when it comes to, some people say, smell doesn't seem to have much information compared to vision. Like there's no spatiality with smell. Other people say, oh no, I mean, we orient ourselves in terms of smell. You smell the bacon, you go in the direction of the bacon. Somebody walks by with a really awesome perfume, you turn around. So it's clear that there are different aspects when it comes to how we experience smell. And this is where, if we do want to do phenomenology, we need to really get out of the armchair. one of my favorite images, because this is not an aspect of, well, not taking experience seriously as philosophers, but really taking it seriously, meaning becoming empirical, so to speak. On the one hand, we need to talk about the people who do this for a living: perfumers, sommeliers, beer tasters, etc. They do this stuff for a living. And what you quickly realize is that a lot of our intuitions about smell are simply wrong. So perfumers have a rich vocabulary about each and every sort of smell. Sommeliers are very good at detecting the year, the vineyard, etc. smell. And of course, there are these wine tasting is junk science kind of articles in The Guardian, etc. These articles rest on a study that is methodologically dubious, to put it nicely. So there's a reason why we should look for expert smellers. But it's not just simply people who train it in terms of their profession, but it's also if you look at other cultures. So the researcher Asfa Majid, for instance, looked at cross-cultural data and showed that, well, it's just that we don't necessarily pay attention to smells, or not generally as a culture, but many other cultures do. And one of my favorite examples from her work is, for instance, the Jahai and the Manik. And the Manik, for instance, have an odor lexicon that is similar to our categorization of color. So we often have like, oh, this smell is banana-like or skunk-like, etc. We connect it with objects we know. And she showed, for instance, that the Manik have like colors. You might have something like red, where you have different objects that are red. And they have kind of a similar system for smells. So it's clearly the way we kind of cognitively train and learn to categorize things. So this is one thing. We got to kind of become more empirical if we want to figure out what smells are on an experiential level. The other way to study it's like, well, we just look at the stuff that smells. That gives us finally some kind of objective basis. Well, what does actually smell? And there's a differentiation. If we look at the objects of perception, we can either talk about mental objects, or we talk about the kind of ordinary objects. So you might actually have, yeah, as you can see, I like the sticky stuff, but you might have like an ordinary object such as an actual corpse. And what emanates from that are the micro objects, such as cadaverine. It smells like it sounds like. I don't recommend smelling it on a daily basis. And then from that, we build kind of mental associations, but they're not neatly lined up. So cadaverine could come either from a corpse, or it could come from a perfume, from a really disgruntled perfumer who hands in his resignation and has kind of a wicked humor. And also we might think, well, it could also be coming from a zombie. We don't know. We had a pandemic. We have now, who knows? I still think zombies might are on the map. But point being is that the idea of what is the object on which we kind of hone in is actually not so easily determined. Besides, we could have also, for instance, a perfume that gives you this kind of dead body odor that doesn't need to be cadaverine. So you quite often have multiple odorants molecules that can give rise to similar enough perceptions. So the whole different aspects of levels of objects isn't so easy either. Why I mentioned that is that's basically what we're trying to match is really this kind of mental objects with some kind of objective cause. And that is our mistake. Because so far, one of the most interesting things is that we can't link smells neatly to chemical structure. And the reason is, first of all, there are high irregularities when it comes to the chemistry involved. So this is an example of 4 different musk molecules. Now, musk is one of the key ingredients in perfumery. There's no chemical similarity between them. They all smell of musk. But you see, one has kind of a long chain structure, then you've got a ring structure, one has nitrogen in it. There's no chemical similarity that's obvious. But they're all musk molecules. You also have the opposite case, like isosteric molecules, similar chemistry in terms of stereochemistry, different smells. Then you have enantiomers, which are mirror-handed molecules. So they're just not superposable. Some smell identical, others do not. So there's a high irregularity that you can't just kind of go, well, we just find the right features and then we know how this works. Furthermore, it's a huge complex of stimuli humans can distinguish. So one study recently published mentioned that humans are able to discriminate over 1 trillion odors. There has been a bit of debate in terms of, well, it might be a bit less, etc. I think the official number is shit tons. But the point being is there's so many things that smell, so many different structures. So the question is, of course, how is that linked then? Besides, smell is the sense where you can, like the only sense so far as we know of at least, where you can create entirely new stimuli. In the lab, you synthesize new molecules with odorants potentially not found in nature, with certain qualities you don't find necessarily associated with objects in nature. So that is a high complexity. Like galaxolite, for instance, was synthesized, so invented in 2012. We can add new things to our map of stimuli. How is that for complexity? Besides, I just talked about single molecules, like monomolecular mixtures. What we smell usually are complex mixtures, hundreds and hundreds of molecules. Right now, you're surrounded by hundreds of molecules. So if you have a mixture, for instance, they behave unpredictably. So perfumers will tell you, sometimes when you create a formula, you put something in, like a mixture, nothing changes. You put more in, nothing changes. You put more of the same thing as, still nothing changes. Or you put something else and then suddenly the whole configuration changes completely. So there is no clear, straightforward path to what is going on here on the chemical level, on the perceptual level. And just to give you an example of that, you quite often have the Aristotelian saying like, well, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Perfumes are a good example. So one of my favorite examples is Eternity by Calvin Klein, which has shit tons of indole. Indole alone actually smells of, well, shit. So Eternity literally is full of shit, which I think is a kind of a very nice perfumer joke, but you of course don't smell it in the perfume. Nobody would have bought that perfume if it would smell fecal. So but it gives a certain grounding. It does contribute to your perception, but it's not necessarily part of the overall percept. So people are trying to figure out, how do we then match these things together? And there are currently two diverging scientific approaches to that challenge. These are the scientific challenge. One thing is, this is just a matter of like complexity. We just need to have the right tools in order to bring these two data sets together. And the other thing is, well, maybe we should look at biology. Maybe biology has more to tell about what the causality involved is. And starting with the first answer, maybe we just need to find the right algorithm, the one that to smell it all, the one to rule it all. And this has become a very popular modeling approach in recent years. This is so far the still most successful paper, which was published in Science, and predicting human olfactory perception from chemical features of odor molecules. It is so far the state-of-the-art paper for that kind of approach. But they didn't predict necessarily in the strict sense, if we think about as philosophers of science. They categorized, but you couldn't predict the next odor from that. And they had a selection of 19 descriptors, but you wouldn't know, for instance, how a mint molecules would, like, what are the features for it, because it's actually not modeled in there. So it's a good data accommodation study, but the success rate was 0.3, which is not that high. And they figured out, hey, sulfurous molecules, like molecules with sulfur often smell sulfurous. Great. Why I criticize that study, besides actually liking it otherwise, is that what they did is they combined two data sets. On the one hand, you've got the ligands from flavor chemistry, where you've got about 5,000 molecular parameters involved per molecules in receptor binding. And on the other hand, you have the verbal descriptors, like this smells, let's say, like fish, this smells like garlic, etc. Words are not perceptions. So there's a lot involved when it comes to psychological mechanisms of how do you arrive at categorization, semantic association, etc. That is excluded here, the psychological as well as the biological mechanisms. And they do matter. And this is where I give you 3 examples that smells are not just simply stimulus chemotopy. The first one is we need to distinguish between semantic and causal objects. So this is where I come back to the 3 levels I mentioned earlier. Namely, you can have certain smells that come from a known macro object, such as a lobster, or from a perfume that smells of lobster. The molecules involved need not be the same. This is a real molecule, a real perfume, by the way. So one thing is, the semantics is not the same as the causal objects. We need to see how do we actually arrive at the semantic associations associated with a stimulus. The next one is we have a semantic ambiguity when it comes to smells, actually. And this is one of my favorite experiments, so I repeat it quite often. But there was a study by Rachel Hertz and Julia van Cleef, who gave people 2 vials. They looked identical, so same size, same liquid, with one difference. They had a different label. And one was labeled Parmesan and the other vomit. Surprisingly, people preferred the Parmesan one over the vomit one. Very, very strange. But they were adamant, like these two molecules, over 83% of people said like these two bottles smell different. They had the same mixture, a mixture of butyric and valeric acid. So people were confused, like, oh, this might be kind of a perceptual illusion. No, because both Parmesan and vomit contain butyric acid. So what's the real smell of butyric acid, then vomity or cheesy? It's kind of both. It's a promiscuous stimulus, so there's an ambiguity. Many odorants come from multiple sources. I mentioned, for instance, Calvin Klein with indole. Your coffee has 3% of indole as well. So I ruined pasta for you, I've ruined coffee for you, I will go on. Then there's the case, and this is one of my favorite cases, of olfactory white, where the neuroscientist Noam Sobel, for instance, thought, is there such a thing as white in olfaction as we know from vision, where the sensory system is basically exposed to the entire stimulus, same intensity at once, and goes like, I can't compute, it's white. Yes, so he did, for instance, a mix of 30 molecules, non-overlapping causal, like key causal features, same intensity, chemically very hard to do, and it smelled like something you haven't known in nature, but it had a distinct smell. He called it Lorax. Then he did a mixture of 60 molecules, same principle, non-overlapping causal features, throwing together, same intensity, smelled the same. Arbitrarily divided it, both like smelled the same. 90 molecules, same principle, like non-overlapping causal features, same intensity, smelled again of Lorax. Arbitrarily divided the two, again of Lorax. Point being is that olfactory quality cannot be straightforwardly linked to particular features of the stimulus. We need to understand how the system, basically what it kind of encodes from nature and how it computes it together. So this is just to show to what extent we really need to look for the third approach, namely biological and cognitive. We need to understand how the sensory system works in order to understand both our perceptions as well as the things we're perceiving. This is the causal angle from which we need to look at that. And this is something I've been pushing, but also my colleague and friend Barry Smith, who worked a lot on flavor perception and wine. So if you're interested in that, I highly recommend his work when it comes to profiling things. Of course, the obvious question then is, okay, so biology, but can biology really tell us something distinctly new about how to understand basically the sense of smell as well as our own experience of it, and what can we take from that? Like the short answer is yes. The long answer is really, really yes. I can only give you the short answer despite talking quite fast and long here. But if you are, and I do a shameless plug, if you are interested in the long answer, this is why I actually wrote the book, because there's so much to say about the brain, about the receptors, about the history of smell and how it changed. But to come at least for the short answer today, it's what I really want to show is if we look at biology proper, we can show that variability is not the same as subjectivity. And that matters. It matters to our understanding of how the mind works. And also if we do want to look for general causal principles by which we can model perception, cognition, and so on. And smells appear subjective because the same stimulus can have so many different interpretations. What you smell, I might not smell the same. You might like it, I might dislike it. You might have features in there I didn't detect. Also, you yourself, you know that sometimes that there's a certain smell, and it seems to smell different at different times. So this is what seems to so hard to model. It has variation between subjects and also within subject variation. But these individual expressions can be explained by general causal principles and mechanisms. And this is what we need to better understand. And in order to show, well, why biology is required, because you might still say, yeah, but it's chemistry. After all, we do smell the environment. We can't tell from the chemistry alone even whether a molecule has a smell. So this is a nice quote from Erwan Poivet's paper. It is nearly impossible to predict whether a given molecule will be odorous and what its odor quality might be from the chemical structure alone. Although all odor molecules are typically organic compounds of low molecular weight, they may be aliphatic or aromatic, may be saturated or unsaturated, and may have any of several polar functional groups. However, there are many molecules that conform to those characteristics which are nonetheless odorless to humans and other animals. Without the biology, you can't even tell whether the thing has a smell, let alone how it smells. And this is one of like two of my favorite examples, because we can't even necessarily say from the chemistry alone what it smells like. Same molecule, different perceptions. And the first one I mentioned yesterday, of course, but is there any one of you who doesn't like coriander or cilantro? You're a mutant. So this is, let me guess, soapy and pungent. And you're like, how can you put this on food? So like there are some people who don't like cilantro because rather than fresh and green, they think, it's soapy, it's pungent. There is a mutation in one of the olfactory receptor genes that changes the sensitivity of that receptor towards the aldehydes in cilantro. And there's a certain group of people who have that mutation who just hate cilantro. So they're not picky eaters. They just really perceive it different. And that's not an exception. In olfaction, that's the norm. Olfaction is one of the most genetically heterogeneous systems. So we all have actually different receptor expressions in our nose. And we're like, okay, this might be just one example. Another example, which really hammers the point home, is androstenone. And androstenone is a pig pheromone. But it does more than just make pigs smell sexy to each other. Humans can also smell it. And this is where it gets really funky, because some people really dislike androstenone. For them, it's like, it smells like body odor. Other people don't like it because it smells urinous. Other people really like it because it smells like woody. And then other people really like it because it smells floral. So you have different qualitative categories, same molecule, different hedonic evaluations, same molecule. What's the reason? Well, partly it's genetic differences, partly it's age, familiarity with the smell. So there's a multiplicity of causal factors that are not random. And this brings us to the question where I bring up Daniel Dennett again, because like, what is then the objectivity? How, like, what's the real smell of a molecule then? And he actually did a couple of years ago in 1981 in his Quine and Qualia paper, a very good summary of what back then looked like a thought experiment. Like, imagine we do X and what comes out. We've seen just now with cilantro actually that this is the case. Properties that seem intrinsic at first often turn out on more careful analysis to be relational. Bennett is the author of Intuition Pump 10, the worldwide eugenics experiment. He draws our attention to phenylthiourea, a substance which tastes very bitter to 3/4 of humanity and is tasteless as water to the rest. Is it bitter? Since the reactivity to phenylthiourea is genetically transmitted, we could make it paradigmatically bitter by performing a large-scale breeding experiment, prevent the people to whom it is tasteless from breeding, and in a few generations, phenol would be as bitter as anything to be found in the world. But we could also, in principle, perform the contrary feat of mass eugenics, and thereby, we should do that, of course, and thereby make phenol paradigmatically tasteless as water without ever touching phenol. Clearly, public bitterness or tastelessness is not an intrinsic property of phenylthiourea, say that 5 times fast in a row, but a relational property since the property is changed by a change in the reference class of normal detectors. And I think this is a great quote related to the examples I just brought. It's not the physical qualities of the chemistry. What we detect is determined by biology. And so the question like, what is the real smell of X is a meaningless question if we don't include the organism that smells us, the genetics that influence how these receptors work. And this is why I think perceptual theorizing, without really taking into account the materiality, really the materiality of this system that processes, is meaningless. It's like dancing about architecture. It makes no sense. Furthermore, we might derive different explanations if we center the biology. And this is a hypothetical example, but there is this molecule citronello, ethyl citronello oxalate, which has usually 2 smells. So it's very musky, but it also has a fruity smell. And some people can only perceive the musky, but not the fruity one. And the reason for that is, again, genetics. So if you think about how the receptors work, they work combinatorially, meaning you have not like one receptor and one molecule that it detects, but you have an odorant that can be detected by multiple receptors via different features, and one receptor can detect different molecules via different chemical features. So you have a combinatorial explosion of possibilities of what you can smell. And you remember vision, usually like 3 color codes. In human olfaction, you have 400 to 420 olfactory receptor genes. With that combinatorial explosion, it makes sense why you might have like about 1 trillion different odor molecules, like stimuli you can discriminate. This is beautiful mathematics of the brain, so to speak. But that might also explain why some people perceive certain odorants in a certain way without all the qualities. So if we have, for instance, the hypothetical example of ethyl citronella oxalate, there might be, let's say, one receptor that is responsible for encoding the part that the brain interprets as fruity. But some people might miss that receptor, because this is one of the fun parts. You and I, we don't have the same receptor expression in our nose. So for you, certain molecules really do not smell exactly the same necessarily as me. You might say, but we still kind of have an overlap. Like we still know what a rose smells like, we can refer to it. Well, because of the combinatorial coding, we have a sufficient overlap of receptors to identify the same thing, but it might not really be exactly the same for us in our minds. So this is not a matter of subjectivity. It really can be explained by genetics, by the receptor mechanism. There is a universal causal explanation, a general causal explanation. And that brings me to the fact of why smell is actually really required to look at, because the idiosyncrasies of the system that have smell, like that have basically put smell always in the basement of like, wow, why would you work on that? It's kind of such a weird smell, weird sense. Well, it tells us a lot about the assumptions we have about what's objectivity, what's the general causal mechanism, what are the key elements by which we model certain things. And rather than looking at idiosyncrasies to be explained away, like the variation of, in olfaction, for instance, we need to just find the general explanation and explain it away so it's not not an issue anymore, is actually perhaps the thing that points us to the real causal mechanisms. So rather than an anomaly, it might be the norm. And this is when we look at smell, it makes a lot of sense because we need a flexible and quickly adaptable system to adapt or to respond to an environment that's constantly in flux. Like, as I mentioned before, you're surrounded by hundreds of molecules you might not see. And you go outside the street and there's a wind whirling the next kind of stuff. You move around. Let's say you move from Canada to Brazil, to Germany, to South Africa. There's different plants, there's different environmental factors. You've got to be able to respond to them. So there needs to be a very flexible system to potentially also after a while adapt to it. And in fact, over your lifetime, your receptors will not necessarily stay the same. Your receptor expression changes throughout the lifespan of an organism. You know, for instance, that olfaction is one of these few systems where you've got adult neurogenesis. So every 3 to 4 weeks, your receptors in your nose are basically being replaced. Otherwise, after 2 or 3 colds, you wouldn't smell a thing. So this is one of the cool things. And after a while, if you basically have in your environment, it actually affects receptor expression. This is a very dynamic system. So that also shows to what extent perceptual meaning, like what we respond to, really needs to be modeled in terms of context, both ecological context as well as the organism itself. For instance, to what extent hormonal changes affect the way you smell certain things. So you know, for instance, that certain smells, depending on whether you're angry, hungry, pregnant, etc., have a different effect on you. Certain qualities are stronger, more salient, or other things kind of irk you in a little bit more. So we need to look at the fact of how we respond to certain things. And with smell, that makes sense because we don't respond to individual molecules, but things in context. We don't smell individual molecules, but everything is a cloud of molecules. And that means I often like to say smell has a promiscuous stimuli. Same molecule, different context, has a different perceptual meaning. I mentioned coffee with indole. Whether you encounter indole in coffee, in jasmine, eternity, or really on the street when your dog poops, has quite a different perceptual meaning. Same with butyric acid. Is it in Hershey's chocolate? By the way, this is the North American version of Hershey's chocolate. It has butyric acid in it. This is why Europeans hate the American version of Hershey. It smells like vomit. Or you might have it actually in Parmesan. And next time you smell Parmesan, heat it actually up. You will smell something vomity. It's weird that it doesn't work the other way around. Nobody goes to vomit and say that goes with pasta. But just to show the meaning is determined really by the context. And that's not a weird thing of the system. That's how it works. And that's where I do want to do one last thing, the plot twist. I want to convince you at least briefly that smell is actually less easy to fool than your eyes. And that's because why do we think that vision is so hard to fool? Well, because everything looks the same from different angles. You've got perspective and variant coding of, for instance, tables. If I move around that table, it's still a table. It doesn't suddenly become a ball. It doesn't suddenly become a tree, etc. And that's because, well, you've got edge detection where simpler features such as lines and edges are integrated into more and more complex objects, allowing you to see and identify. And I know I'm simplifying the visual system. A friend of mine is a vision scientist, and he's always like, you simplify the visual system. It's like, I know, but he's not here, and I will go on. But the point is that this is based on these features of perspective and variant coding. You can trick the system with visual illusions quite distinctly. My favorite example for that is the Ames room, where if you know that example, you've got this wonderful arrangement that you have two people of kind of the same size that look from the kind of viewing people important. You have got a very restricted view. You can't move around. You're just looking from one particular angle. And one looks like super tall, like a giant, and the other one very, very small, even though the people are the same height, basically. If you could move, you could, of course, assess the situation. But from your static standpoint, your brain has two options to interpret it. And it doesn't make sense, of course. Like, nobody necessarily assumes that you have this kind of weirdly shaped room. And there are many other visual examples who go like that. You can target your visual system to create certain illusions. And this was an example also, if you look at the history of science, I often like to say history of science is like Google. Some idiot had the same idea as you had before. In this case, I'm happy to say that the idiot was Hermann von Helmholtz, who's one of my favorite researchers of all time, who actually said, if you look at the visual system, the retina activation alone will not tell you whether this is a scenery, like a real scenery, or a picture. You gotta have movement, you gotta have kind of unconscious inferences, learned associations with the scenery, but the stimulus and the receptor activation alone doesn't give you meaning. That brings me to smell. So one of my favorite examples when it comes to smell and the question of, well, how much can you really change the perceptual meaning of a smell? Again, talk to perfumers. And Christophe Lotamiel did one example where he put sulfurol, the molecule you see here, on a smelling strip. And everybody had that smelling strip. So you weren't fooled because nobody was taking it away from you. You had it in your hand the whole time. When I say sulfur, you're like, okay, how does it smell like? Well, it smells kind of organic, fatty, a bit sweet. I'll be honest, I wasn't quite sure whether I liked it or not. And you heard this murmur in the audience, like, what is it? It has a distinct smell. What is it? And then he showed a picture of warm milk, and everybody did the, of course, it's warm milk. Like, you suddenly had this image in your head. It smelled like warm milk. It was very bizarre. Then you switched the screen, and it was ham. The milk was gone in your mind, and suddenly it smelled of ham. It's very bizarre because, of course, you wouldn't say, oh, it doesn't smell the same. You could have also, by the way, done beans or chicken, because the point is sulfurol is contained in milk, it is contained in ham, it is contained in chicken, it is contained in beans. Promiscuous stimuli. So you can actually change it. And I also asked him, like, you're the one actually pulling the trigger, you know, back and forth and back and forth. And it was really weird because in your mind it was like ham, warm milk, ham, warm milk. It was absolutely bizarre. You heard the audience just going, oh my goodness. And he said, like, I can't change it. Like, when he pulls the trigger, it also changes for him. He can't stop also that kind of perceptual switch. What I want to say with that is smells have more than one quality. So this is why I think smells are an expression of Walt Whitman's poem, I contain multitudes. Like, yes, there are contradictions. Yes, there are multiple features. That's how smell works. Unlike color, where, you know, you see the red, but you don't see blue at the same time. With many odorants, they have multiple odor notes. There's cis-3-hexanol, there's green in there. There's a bit of earthiness in there. There's fresh in there. You have many odorants that have more than one quality. And you can manipulate what might be more salient in your mind when you smell that, of course. And this is why I said, like, well, what I wanted to do today was really remove the stain of subjectivity. Actually, smell is much more objective and harder to fool than you think, because it is a system that requires you to really look at context and what something means, rather than being fooled by a certain situation. And this brings me to the takeaway points, namely, first of all, what smells are as perceptual qualities. We just need to get rid of our stupid ideas of our naive ideas of, well, you know, perceptions are certain kind of categories. We match onto the stimulus, and we just need to find the right causal link to computation, link them together. That's not how it works. Then it just depends rather like how smells are processed by the system. Namely, we need to look at the biology, we need to look at cognition based on biology, and then we get a different understanding of objectivity. Namely, rather than stimulus response models, we need to look at what is the behavior that is regular, and how can we reproduce that behavior. And then we get a completely different picture, basically, on how cognition works. And in that context, smell is a good example because it is markedly different from vision. I don't say it's completely different. I think there are general sensory principles, but we don't detect them because we're looking at the wrong features. Smell has a different neural representation. It has a different way in which the receptors work. But there are other things that are similar, such as in order to understand the stimulus, we got to look at the receptors. We got to look at the genetics of the organism and the environment. So this is why I say like the idiosyncrasies might help us to figure out what the real things are. And this is why, one last thing, what we really need is a theory of perception that's system theoretic. And this is a picture by my former mentor, I mean, not Magritte, but Stuart Feuerstein, who actually adjusted that one. And the original painting by Magritte has an egg here that turns into a dove. And he did the same with smells. Like, what is actually happening in that kind of translation? And to end on a high note, because I said like, well, this has kind of implications for philosophy. Like, okay, how can we now know everything is contextual? We know certain things stay the same. What can philosophers then contribute to that? It's kind of and this is where I like to highlight my personal hero, Pat Churchland. I'm a huge fangirl. When she does what she described as neurophilosophy as a philosophical program. Namely, rather than really looking at our established categories of perception and just trying to find some neuroscience data that fits with it and have our argument and cake and eat it, so to speak, we might want to rethink the categories by which we describe the mind through these revolutionary advancements in neuroscience. What we think of as perception, what we think of as memory, what we think of as consciousness might not be the thing we have historically understood as such. Memory is completely different because it's much more temporal, much more flexible. Same with smell, as I just showed you. There are lots of things that we kind of misrepresented, rather than being a neglectable sense, rather than being subjective. To the contrary, it might really crack the code. And this is where you say like, okay, fair enough, but how would we do that in the lab? Invite me in 2 years, and I might be able to tell you, because I currently started a lab, and this is my grad student, Gabe, where we're trying to actually implement what I just presented today. How can we potentially understand the contextuality of smell, the temporal processing rather than the spatial processing, and the semantic association with intrinsically ambiguous stimuli? I can't tell you now what we're doing because it's in the process, but in 1 or 2 years, we might either tell you a good story or a wonderful story about a great failure. So I do hope it's the first one. And with that, I want to say thank you very much, and also thank Terry Akery, Barry Smith, and Stuart Feuerstein, who have quite often entertained my variety of ideas. And I'm actually quite curious about your questions now. So thanks for listening to my rant about why smell is the greatest model system ever.
We have time for questions. And what we're going to do is type out the question form, and then people and so we can ask questions. For the people online, can write the questions in the chat. And then
if possible, if the person in the audience could try to speak loud so people aren't listening, or if you want to kind of repeat the question.
I can do that. Fair enough. So for the people online, you will hear more of my voice. I'm very sorry. I will repeat the question being asked and try to provide a meaningful answer. That would be if you could.
Just raise your hand. I'm going to try to keep track. Raise their hand first. Yeah. So great talk. And I have two questions. Right at the end, when you're talking about perceptual systems, I'm curious whether you think that there's one way of thinking about perceptual systems quite general, or are they so different that it's going to be, smell is so different from sight, which is so different from haptic sense, which is so different from hearing, that they end up being so distinct that there isn't a kind of common way of thinking of them all perceptual systems? Where do you think that's going to?
I love that question. So to repeat it, the question is to what extent the sensors really are as modular as I kind of suggested, which was mainly for convenience. To what extent really can you individuate the sensory systems, or is there more overlap? Are they really distinct, etc.? I don't think they're as modular as we often model them. I think this is a mere modeling convenience. There are some wonderful overlaps and there are some wonderful differences. And my answers actually, and this is why I got super interested in embodied robotics lately, is that quite often a lot of perceptual problems are best solved by the integration of different systems, which you can model, of course, independently, but you will get a deceptively more complex version sometimes if you model, for instance, vision separate from motor responses and so on. When it comes to smell, of course, there's a lot of cross-modal influences, for instance, with sound, with pictures, with words. It's partly an artifact of how we model it. When it comes to individuating the senses, there are some interesting differences when it comes to at least part of the pathway. So if we look at the receptors, smell receptors are different in that sense that there was a study in 2020 by the Firestein lab actually showing to what extent you have allosteric modulation in the receptors. That has been hitherto unknown in any other system at the periphery. So there's definitely some interesting differences. In order to find the commonalities, we need to kind of the Churchland program, we need to rethink what we assume something is for. So it's an answer yes and no. I think there are some interesting differences when it comes to specialization. There is a specialization with vision when it comes to the representation of stability, although I think movement is actually something quite often overlooked. That being said, I don't think that that's separate, that you can just have, this is vision, this is taste, this is, no.
Okay, so for to objectify sex, right? I guess I'm asking you personally. Would you look at reactions to it, or would you look at neuron response to? What do you like? Where do you?
I think all of these are part of the answer. I don't think there's a principal answer in that sense, and that's why I love when you ask different people what is smell. Like you ask a chemist, and they will tell you something about double bonds and bicyclical compounds, etc. Then you ask a neuroscientist who tells you something about there's kind of certain traces in certain areas. Then you have a biologist, behavioral biologist who's like, well, it depends on the organism and what the adaptive function is. And then you go to a perfumer, so it's like, where's the pleasure? Where's the aesthetic value? Then you've got a philosopher who goes like, it sits at the border between conscious and unconscious processing. So it depends who you ask. And I think all of them are part of the answer. I don't think it depends what you expect from the answer. I personally actually make a mix between really behavioral responses and neural traces, but I do think that we need to think about the behavioral responses in terms of experience. That is not easy to answer.
So would you find studies that attempt to bring different fields together? Is that kind of is that what you're saying? Where it goes? So behavior with chemistry.
So the nice thing is that many olfactory scientists actually do lots of collaborations. For instance, Stuart Firestein, in whose lab I worked before, his study was influenced by the work of Christophe Lodamiel. He asked him, for instance, like, okay, I'm trying to do that. Which odorants would you recommend? What are the effects here? So you quite have to often also, Stuart, for instance, works with Terry Akery, who's a flavor and fragrance chemist, and who now wants to move more into psychology. So there's a lot of collaboration. Or Barry Smith is a philosopher and cognitive scientist who also works, for instance, with clinical researchers on smell loss. COVID was, of course, the big thing there. So there is a lot of collaboration going on. The question is, of course, time, funding, the usual things. So it's a field, I kid you not, if you want to go into a field that will in the next 10 years still yield some really interesting surprises, olfaction. Yeah.
It's a question which is the general part and also the very specific question. The general part is this: you touched upon, but you never made explicit, and you sort of very much inside the evolutionary purpose role of all this complicated things. So I was wondering whether you sort of slightly neglected
On purpose, yes.
or some you know what I mean? And the simple silly question attached to that is this: what do you know about the difference between this complicated story between humans and other mammals? Because there's a lot of folk knowledge that says that other mammals have rely much more. I don't know if it's true or not. Rely much more on smell, and sort of we humans are species that I don't know, maybe because it moved around, learn to rely a little bit less. We're supposed to rely a lot less than cats. That's related because
I love these questions. So the first question for the people who couldn't hear it is, well, I left out the evolutionary part. I mean, I pointed at it, but I didn't say much. Was it on purpose? Yes. The reason for that is actually caution, because one issue with many explanations appealing to evolutionary explanations is that they end up to be just so stories. How much of that is really what we know, or how much is that, again, our intuitions about how we think things work. And I'll give you an example which, for me, for instance, shows to what extent we really have to be careful. So you know the example that if you, in sensory studies, you give people two beverages, and you lace one with food coloring, so it's brighter. And people are convinced like this, the brighter one is sweeter, even though the taste didn't change. And people say, oh, that makes sense evolutionarily, because, we're looking for brighter fruit and they're sweeter. But then you have cross-modal studies. There was a study with 5 different shampoo bottles. Like one was scented with lavender, one was scented with mint, forgot what the others were. And people were adamant that the mint one made their hair feel softer. Same shampoo otherwise. So what is the evolutionary explanation for smell, like scent actually affecting your sense of touch? It's not so obvious. Maybe there is one, but this is why I'm often cautious with overstretching these kind of arguments, because it's so easy to be trapped in just so stories that are more on intuition. Which brings me to your second question, namely, what is the relation or comparison between humans and other animals when it comes to scent abilities? We're not so bad. So you often hear dogs are so much better at smelling, and then there's mice and etc. Well, yes and no. There was, again, Noam Sobel, so the one with olfactory white. He did a study where he had like a dog trace a pheasant, and you see the dog kind of doing this kind of cross back and forth to hone in on the trail and find the pheasant trail. And then he did a study with 32 Hungary Berkeley undergraduate students to follow a scented chocolate trail in the grass. So he had patted them, like the knees were patted, they had sensory, like basically they had like a glass, so they couldn't see anything, they couldn't hear anything, they could just follow the trail. First of all, they did precisely the same as the dogs were doing, meaning you hone in on the concentration and you go like, where is this? With more and more practice, they were getting better as well. So it's not that we can't do it, it's just that we don't do it, because we don't have our noses on the ground where the smells emanate from. So this is one thing. The other thing is you couldn't pay me to basically rob at an airport and sniff out people's luggage. Dogs have a phenomenal sense of smell, don't get me wrong, but it's often used as, and humans are so poor at smelling. They're not poor at smelling, actually. The next thing is, if you think about mice, who are also great smellers, quite often we'll say like, well, mice have 1,000 odorant receptor genes, dogs have over 800, I think it's like 875, humans have only 420, so there's more genes, must be better. And then there was a study actually lesioning parts of the bulb, 80%, there was no change in behavior of the mice. So there's an issue about redundancy in biology. Because again, where do you have your nose as a dog or as a mouse? On the ground. What's also on the ground? Lots of contaminants, shit, piss, etc. So you actually have these long snouts with these turbines, which filter out a lot of odors, of course. So in order to have like an actual good sense of smell, you have to have basically more receptors, etc. So it's the answer again is not so straightforward. They're amazing smellers, but so are we. It's just like, what do we use the sense for? Bringing me to the next part of the answer, namely, well, there's often the comment, you know, dogs use the sense of smell for the distance. We often use smell like as a close-up sense for food, or we smell things like close up. But again, what depends on what you use it for. If you talk to hunters, if you talk to people who really train themselves to go hunting, they have a phenomenal distal sense of smell. So a colleague of mine, she did several interviews with kind of the last remaining cowboys in New Mexico. They can tell you from a distant way, okay, there's a puma, like a puma over there, and there's a bear over there. Like they have an amazing ability. Similar, there's this great book on like anthropological studies by Constance Klaas and David Howes, and I'm currently blanking on the third name. And they had a case study of the Desana Indians in the Amazon. Well, if you are somewhere in the Amazon and there's like lots of plants and fog, you don't see the predator, but you will smell it. So it depends also again on the environment and how you train to use it. So you can train your sense of smell is much better than you think. And that's actually a paper title from Gordon Shepherd, who's like one of the first olfactory neuroscientists who really took smell seriously already in the 1970s prior to the receptors. And he had a paper saying like, well, the human sense of smell is better than we think. And a colleague of us, Avery Gilbert, wrote to him an email saying, got one thing wrong. It's not just better than you think, but when you think. Because a lot of our appreciation for smell and the discernment come with cognitive engagement. Like if you actually employ language, you can use it almost like a tool to like a cognitive handle. It's never about the words. It's about for your mind to put on something and then discern it. That's a very long answer, but yeah.
Question from, we're done.
Do you think there are any olfactory illusions? And do they work differently from visual illusions?
I like the question. So are there olfactory illusions? Are they different from vision? The Parmesan vomit thing, for instance, is described in the paper as an olfactory illusion. And I don't think it's an illusion, because illusion means that you're somehow deceived. What's the deceptive thing here? It smells of both. I think illusion is kind of a misguided term. I really think so, and I don't think there will be illusions in the same way as we describe visual illusions. If there's a different way to understand it, I currently don't have a good answer, but I'm not a big fan of the notion of illusion. I think it's quite often something which, kind of like the notion of emergence, it's a black box for something we haven't understood yet. I'm a hardcore reductionist, as you can tell, in a way that I just think we need to rethink the causality rather than just saying, oops, emergence.
If we think about illusion in a certain way, I mean, like the illusion of the room that has
the Ames room, yeah.
Yeah. So in that case, you have a limited perspective. There are olfactory illusions because everything is so context sensitive, so that it's not as if. So in some sense, you think that sort of you have a limited perspective, a limited context, so you're misreading it. Olfaction, everything is so context sensitive, but there isn't.
Well, both in terms of context sensitive as well as, so in this context, for instance, you've got a reading of two completely different situations. With, if you have, for instance, the Parmesan vomit thing, it's not really different. It's different because we have different mental associations, but it's not really two different situations in the physical sense. Here you have a difference between two physical scenarios, where here it's just like the semantic association.
And in the milk case, it's not an illusion because when you shift the concept, what you actually are smelling is the milk or the candy.
You do, yeah. It's so this is why I think that smell is an excellent model system for thinking about conscious and unconscious processing, because quite often it's not the matter that the signals on there. And you know that when you sometimes have a wine, so this is an example I mentioned yesterday, but when you have a wine tasting, for instance, and somebody says, oh, I really like that wine, especially that vanilla note, suddenly it's in your mind, you don't sometimes even need to smell it again. So this is not suggestibility, but there is something that is not consciously being processed that for some reason you still have access to. And this is why I think that illusion is a misleading term, because you might have not two physical, like you don't have two separate physical situations. You really just have a difference in processing the signals. And you might kind of, I know there's different theories of consciousness, and I don't want to get into that, but let's just really go for spotlight right now. Then you might just have a different spotlight on different activity patterns. But it's the same stimulus, and it's just a matter of what's being highlighted, what's more salient, and that you can switch quite dynamically. Again, this is why I think we need to go away from stable object representation and more towards like dynamical systems.
Yeah. So.
It's okay. So the question is basically given the extreme sensitivity of the olfactory sense, what would be the problems in the lab, right? Like in terms of if you really want to put it into an experimental practice, lots of problems. So one example, for instance, is if you do psychophysical studies and you prepare certain solutions that you want your test subjects to smell, if you run out of the solution, you can't just make a new one and continue the same study. You have to start the study new with a larger batch of a solution, because the most minute contaminants or kind of concentration changes can really affect your results. This is what makes it so different. Another challenge is actually habituation. So your receptors, after a while, habituate to the smells around you. This is why you don't smell your pullover right now, you don't smell your environment. You would immediately smell a change in your olfactory environment. If, let's say, your neighbor, I'm very sorry, would fart right now, that's immediately there because it's a concentration change. Your sense of smell is less for stable object recognition, but more for there's a change right now. Like there's some kind of, it's kind of a change detector rather than stability of object detector. Now, basically with habituation, you stop smelling certain things, and you stop smelling them at different times because different receptors adapt to their environment at different speeds. So that's why a complex mixture after a while really starts to smell different after a while. And then, of course, if you're trying to have a subject and test them 20 minutes on the same smell, not is that boring, but also at some point they would just stop smelling things. One way around that is, 1 second. This is where I'm getting excited, and I say, like, talk to me in 1 or 2 years. One way around that is designing an instrument, such an olfactometer, that has an exposure short enough to be not so that the receptors don't adapt. And so you can't buy olfactometers industrially. You have to, either you build it yourself or you have somebody who builds one. And this is the olfactometer built by Terry Acree, which is quite special. So Barry Smith and I, we got one. It has an exposure of an odor puff of 70 to 75 milliseconds. That's long enough to have a conscious perception of a smell and short enough so that you don't habituate. So we can test subjects for 20 minutes on the same smell. They might find it boring, but they won't habituate. But most olfactometers are like 100, 120 milliseconds. You can't do that forever. So this is where it's like, ask me in a couple of years. I'm quite excited. But this is another challenge. So if adaptability, the chemistry itself in terms of like small concentration changes, then you have to be very careful that the subjects are not wearing any perfume themselves, for instance, or that the experimenter isn't wearing anything themselves. You have to have, when you've got a lab, a high room exchange, so that you've got a constant kind of exchange of air in the room, so it's as odorless as possible. What do you have in the room? don't do carpet. So there's a lot of things to consider actually. So it's a very good question. Like it's such a sensitive sense that it's a nightmare to think about all the things that could affect it. Indeed. Yeah. I don't know whether that answered your question. Okay, I can go on all day, as you see. This is my cousin, one of my favorite cousins. I have many favorite cousins, but this one actually went like, you don't have many social contacts anymore, do you? So,
we have a question from people online, and it's kind of a follow-up on the illusion question that we have before. So, here it is. If the Parmesan cake is not the smell illusion, would you think it could be compared to bistable picture?
I know that Terry Aker would say yes. I am not so sure, for the reason is that you actually don't have the same stability that you have with bistable pictures in terms of a stimulus. With odorants, for instance, given that you don't know in which context, for instance, the same smell really can adopt a different, it's much more indeterminate than a bistable picture. Like if you've got the rabbit duck, you've got a limited amount of interpretations. With molecules, given all these different contexts in which you could incorporate it, so let's say, again, you might have sulfurol and you might have it in milk, you have it in ham, you have it in chicken, you have it in beans. It will be in many others. So the range of associations you can have with that molecule is not infinite, but more indeterminate than a bistable picture. The principle of having like different angles, I would say, is a good comparison. But the like how many interpretations of one thing, I would say, is where the comparison ends.
So then if there are multiple interpretations, I guess this is what the experiment will be for, but trying to figure out whether there's something in the biology that changes when the interpretation changes as well. Because you have one stimulus, you have multiple.
Something must change. Like yeah, it's not the same.
Yeah. It's just like the focus and something.
So the question is like, what does change if you've got a stimulus where you've got multiple interpretations? Where does the change happen? What's the change? That's the open question, which I'm trying to figure out. So again, I can't give you an answer yet, but that's precisely the question I'm actually interested in figuring out. And this is why I say, instead of looking at spatial representation, you might want to look at temporal integration. Yeah. So I can't tell you yet. That is, as you see, I'm doing kind of a self-generating job security. Just ask me two years, and then I will have the answer. Hopefully, maybe not.
Yeah. I agree that there could be no illusion in olfactory experience, but olfactory experience could generate different kind of belief. Like if there is a format in front of me and I smell it as vomit, then it generate my belief that there is vomit, but that is false. But if my olfactory experience tells me that okay, that's format, then it will generate. Then that's true. So I'm wondering how your denial
Very good question. So the question is, to what extent and I like this, like the denial about olfactory illusions, how does that affect the way in which beliefs influence our smell? Well, I like that you put it so strongly. So the things I do, there are top-down processes. So the way in which we approach certain smells will affect the quality. And I'm actually quite fond, for instance, and I know that you're gonna hate me for a moment for that. Please bear with me. But I'm quite fond of some aspects of the predictive brain. Yeah, he's just like, I'm leaving. No, but there are some aspects of that idea that, at least in the sense of Hermann von Helmholtz. So there are, of course, certain things in which you've got top-down influences also in smell. What I deny is that quite often a lot of olfactory changes are referred to as, oh, this is just a change of belief. That's part of the story, but as I mentioned today, we're kind of with that explanation overlooking actually the bottom up, like where's the ambiguity already integrated on the receptor level. So for me, this is just a matter of integrating different causal explanations. But yes, there's belief update in olfaction. You can definitely change somebody's perception, like what they're focusing on top down. If you look at the olfactory system, actually, much earlier, sorry for the very quick kind of a techno reversal, but if you look at the olfactory system in particular, it's a highly feedback based system. So the integration between, for instance, the olfactory bulb and the olfactory cortex, there's much more feedback connections from the piriform cortex to the olfactory bulb than kind of input driven. You have, for instance, a lot of feedback. There's a lot of feedback from the olfactory, from the orbitofrontal cortex to the olfactory cortex. So it's a very feedback-based system. It's much less driven by input than you would think. How the input is coded, however, matters in relation to the feedback. This was like I don't like debates that go like decide on one. It's like it can be both causal explanations. We just have to be a bit more sophisticated with both explanations. So I wouldn't say this would be a problem. I hope you will forgive me. Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about like how in the device that we live in today, the modern architecture, how we think like the whole structure, right? And like I'm just trying to compare to like, for example, like translation, like if you like ask me to refer like a giant one, I'll be like, yes, it's actually doesn't hurt as much. And like with the like smell and thinking about like doesn't like half the time be like, oh, it smells like clover, now it smells like musk. And like what is sort of like temporal structure that makes that perception other sensory perceptions, especially ones that are like
Well, one difference to temporal structure is, of course, receptor habituation. Like even like single odorants, of course, given the combinatory coding, after a while, receptors will habituate at different times. That's one part of the answer. Yeah. Yeah. So you don't even feel like you pull over right now. You would go mental if you could feel everything that's basically on your body. You couldn't focus on anything. That's part of the answer. I think there's more to the answer actually. And I like that comparison with touch and habituation and the temporal structure. I'll be honest, I would like to think about it more because I think this is a very good question, but the habituation will be part of the answer. Let me think about this more actually. Thank you. I gotta say, because I agree with you that there is something in which where we need to have a better understanding of both integration, inhibition changes, but yeah, I need to think about that more. I think it's partly because it's partly an open question, partly because I also need to think about it more. But I like the question. Thank you.
You're not. Yeah, sure.
yeah, it's just I think about the kind of like for your you're talking about leaving so much, and then a lot of psychology people don't like to talk illusions because they just say this is a visual illusion. What illusion is like to see like the feature of
Sorry, it's just like it's not me. But Yeah, who can't actually perceive the Müller-Lyer illusion and the Ebbinghaus illusion. I love that so much. And you know why? Because it shows to what extent perception is a skill. And I talked to my chair who's quite historically fond, like she's fond of history, and I was like, oh my goodness, and Paul Churchland had this before me because he actually described perception explicitly as you learn perception, it's not a given. And she Jutta, she looked at me like, the 19th century already had people who said that. So it's actually not even a new idea, but it shows to what extent we really need to rethink the senses based on what they afford us, and partly in terms of what you say, like cross-cultural studies show to what extent some things we take as given and hardwired as the system might be much more flexible based on experience, both with terms of development as well as maintenance. And there's also another argument. So I like your focus on development. But that brings it actually back to your question about the modularity of the sensors. I got super excited about cyborg sensors because like the augmentation of the senses with new technology, can we create sensory experience that we wouldn't perceive otherwise? Can we look at how animals perceive certain kind of stimuli? Can we have like a similar thing for us? And there's of course some people like Neil Harbison and a couple of others who try to design new things to, let's say, perceive like electromagnetic influences from Earth. Like, could we perceive them potentially? And other things. And that kind of got me to think, maybe we got also the way we individuate the senses wrong. Like, what are the capacities of a system? If you can plug in or you can modify, augment a sense, there are certain structures that some sensory system afford you to perceive, certain spatial structures, certain temporal structures, and whatever. And to what extent can you show to what extent what the causality of the senses is misleading? So my example is like vision might not be there to see, but might be there, or the visual cortex might not be there to see necessarily, but to do spatial navigation. Because you see, when people, for instance, lose their sense of sight, the visual cortex is taken over, so to speak, a lot from in terms of hearing, because then people rely much more on spatial navigation in terms of hearing. Then you think about hearing as the kind of quintessential temporal processing. If you think about, well, speech is kind of sequential, music is kind of very sequential, and then you think about things about like speech, let's say Broca's area. Well, gorillas have Broca's area. So there's clearly something else that's being processed based on which language, for instance, piggybacks, and which are connected to auditory processing. So maybe we got the function of the cortex wrong. Smell, I would say, is change detection. So maybe with these kind of cyborg sensors, we might also get a different understanding of what the senses are for and what the causality, like what's the function, what's the causality. So I like the developmental aspect, because of course that is where you wire up the system, you kind of acquire certain function. There's still enough flexibility to change it afterwards, but it's a good example to show it's less hardwired than we think. There might be much more functionality to discover. Again, Churchland's neurophilosophy program, maybe our preconceived notions of modularities or certain functions are just because historically acquired notions, rather than really how the system works on a neural, on a causal level.
Like modularity you can get with, flexibility.
You want to keep modularity? I mentioned Paul Churchland. He and Jerry Fodor had this like huge fight. So I'm not a big fan of modularity. I'm not fully against it, but I wonder what the notion is for. Like, what do you want to do with that notion? Is, I think, my question then back.
Like, I'm just thinking like what the alternative would
I don't even think you need an alternative notion. I got co-opted by my department, like dynamical systems, neural networks, all the way. It's like, yeah, they kind of, I think they kind of get you in there. It's kind of cold.
I mean, like,
We're gonna stop here, sorry. We have one more question, and then maybe you can just ask the question. Sorry, this could go.
I think it's historical neglect. Partly, I think there are two answers to that. So the question is basically, is there a reason, or what's the reason, like for the people on Zoom, what's the reason, or is there a reason why we really neglected theorizing about smell, which I think is a very good question because it has multiple answers. I like these questions which have multiple answers. One thing is historical neglect, at least in like, let's say European academics or the kind of philosophers where we had a complete overhaul of the senses. Flavor and smell used to be much more prominent, for instance, in ancient Greek. But then you had the Enlightenment, which made a hierarchy of the senses. And I mocked Kant a little bit. I'm actually a closet Kantian, I admit that. But he was wrong when it came to smell. But this is where you had this kind of cognitive hierarchy of the senses. And the other reason is actually worse than just imposing a cognitive hierarchy. There was also a lot of sexism and racism involved with like neglecting smells. So, for instance, smell was often seen as this sense of, you know, the sensitive people. The women, for instance, were just like overly sensitive to smells, and there are some really weird theories about that because clearly we can't be trusted. And the other thing is also you often had racist remarks about other, like basically other cultures smelling. You had quite often comments about the working class being kind of seen as more smelly because, well, there was, for instance, factory workers, or you had people working coal mines. So smell was often used to differentiate between the sexes, between cultures, between classes. Which often was then just seen as not a good topic for polite conversation, as the English would say. So there's a lot of aspects when it comes to it. It was just not a really reputable topic. That's one thing. The other thing is also it's really hard to study scientifically. So one thing is cultural and historically. The other thing is really, well, how would you measure smell? Because what I mentioned, for instance, to you earlier, is like, well, if you have like slightest contaminations, it already affects certain things. How do you have a really controlled exposure to a stimulus? And even just the variability within an individual, for instance, that depending on the time of the day, depending on what somebody ate, how hungry somebody is, all that can affect their responses. So it's a nightmare just to model when it comes to the organism. And then the complexity of the stimulus. Besides, for a long time, of course, I mean, the idea that chemical similarity has something to do with smell quality is 19th century. So it's a shorter scientific history. It's a lack of instruments. At some point, it was a lack of funding and lack of reputability in terms of the topic. There's unfortunately many reasons. And this has really changed within the last 30 years. I mean, this is why I highlighted Buck and Axel, because they really catapulted smell from this weird niche thing into this might actually help us to understand structure, function, and proteins better. The way in which the brain processes smells might give us a couple of really wonderful new revelations about how the brain works. There was a study published, excuse me, last year, which I mentioned yesterday, for instance, by two postdocs from Richard Axel's lab, where they showed that the piriform cortex actually doesn't have a stable representation of odors. So not just is there no spatial arrangement of like where odors are, but even the neurons that are basically like where you've got the projections of axons into all kinds of corners of the piriform cortex. If you have mice and you train them on an odor, after between 28 and 31 days, it's a complete different set of neurons that respond to that odor. You've got a complete representational drift. You know that from some memory systems. So there's something going on that is much more connected to association and memory rather than stable input driven. And that was a huge discovery. It even made it to like Ed Young's report in The Atlantic, which was hailed as, oh, scientists don't know what's going on. It's like, no, actually, I'm not surprised, and many olfactory research weren't surprised. It's just that nobody paid attention. But it shows to what extent smell is really a good system to rethink the senses, because a lot of that flexibility, maybe not in the same range, you will find in other senses too. So the vision, for instance, is being recently shown to be much more flexible than, for instance, I presented it. So when I kind of simplify it, I do that with kind of a cheeky note of actually smell helps us to see how flexible vision also is. So to come back to a question, cultural prejudice as well as really simply it's very tricky to study. I mean, honestly, it's not something if you want to go into science, like, yeah, do that, that's easy. No. If you like a challenge, go into smell.
It's not.
Thank you.